Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining Michelle Benz and I in this video to learn a little bit more about our approach to the layers of reading and the layers of writing. As we begin, we want to share that we are gathered on Treaty 7 land, and we acknowledge that this is the unceded lands of the Blackfoot Nations, which include the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai peoples, of the Yarhe Nakota Nations, which include the Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Goodstoney peoples, and of the Tsuut'ina First Nation. As well as this is the gathering place of Métis Nation of Alberta, and we are on the Battle River Territory. Within this territory, Michelle and I live on Districts 4 and Districts 5. We have been lucky enough to have spent the majority of our adult lives living, learning, teaching, playing on Treaty 7 land. And over our careers in education, between Michelle and I, we have been teachers, coaches, leaders, directors, researchers in education and literacies. We both have our PhDs in literacy and learning, and through our experiences have been fortunate enough to work with schools and districts from junior kindergarten through grade 12 across Western Canada. In this video, we wanted to take a brief moment to share our stance or our beliefs around literacy, a term that can be sometimes a little contentious and even ambiguous. So for us, literacies are complex and contextually bound. Because of this, we take a comprehensive view. And within this view, we do our best to weave the art and sciences of literacy together. Finally, we see literacy as a human right. In the work we do our best to weave that stance throughout everything. So we are fortunate enough to work with multiple partners and stakeholders at all grade levels, where we tailor learning to your context, your needs, and your population, and where we work with you in flexible ways, drawing from various frameworks and approaches to offer support for all learners.
So when we partner with educators, we strive to support them by building those understandings and the knowledge that helps them support their learners in literacy. We often do this work through working with our literacy frameworks or tools that we've developed by looking at the research and then moving that research to practice and then refining these frameworks or tools over time as we put them into classrooms. You might be familiar with our layers of reading development graphic or our layers of writing development. We, in fact, have many frameworks that help guide educators in the many different ways that they can intervene with literacy learning. So the purpose of this video is to share a little bit of insight into the how and the why of these frameworks, how they help educators move current research to practice, and ultimately how these frameworks support educators in meeting the needs of their diverse learners in their classrooms today. So let's start with reading. And when we think about doing literacy work with reading, there's many different approaches we can use. Often we think when we want to move that needle of all the factors that are influencing how that learner is taking up reading. We call that a systems approach. Alternatively, another way to come at it is to zoom in on just one factor and work really intensely in one layer of the layers of reading development graphic. Really, both these perspectives are important and they are essential in moving that needle, but they also not only increase our reading outcomes, but they also help those readers become more motivated, more confident, and have more self-efficacy in their reading. Finally, what we would like to do is share some of the key research perspectives that we draw on and that we think are really critical to reading instruction. And that's because we look at multiple perspectives as literacy is complex, and each different perspectives brings a different consideration that we think influences our reading practices. Okay, let's look at that systems approach where we have all of those factors working together. And really, this mirrors that literacy is truly complex. In fact, when we think of reading development, we often think of a web of interconnected factors that not only shape each factor shaping the learner, but each factor shapes the other factors that then come together to all shape how that learner is taking up reading in that moment. Note that when we talk about a systems approach, it's not comprehensive. We haven't included every single factor that influences reading, but instead what we've tried to do is draw out those critical considerations for Miriam and I. They're really important to think about when we think about our reading design and our instruction. Our systems approach always begins with the learner, though, and that's because the research is really clear on this. When we consider where that learner is at, the strengths that they bring, and the effective supports or scaffolds that work for that learner, that's when learning progresses the fastest and it becomes also deeper learning. In fact, if you think about whether you are a physics teacher or whether you are a kindergarten teacher, the students that are sitting in front of us, they all bring different skill levels, different attitudes, different motivations, different purposes for reading, which all influences how they take up that reading. Another factor within the system, there is a little bit more continuity. So where every learner is different, when we look at the skills and understandings that we need our learners to have to be effective readers, there is that consistency. Again, when we look to the research, it tells us what those core skills and understandings are that effective readers have, why these skills matter. So what's the role that they play in the reading process and how they develop. What we've done is we've looked at that research and we tried to synthesize all of those things into what we call that layers of reading development graphic. This is a framework that we use, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes. The third factor within the system is what we call the community of reading culture. This assumes that all reading takes place within a particular culture or space. That is, whenever we're reading, there are certain attitudes, values, behaviors that shape how we read, our motivation, or even the purpose for reading. Think about that student and how they use reading in English class, and then they walk across the hall to math class. They're still using reading, but they're coming at it in a very different way. The final factor is one of our favorites because it is one that we have probably the most control over as a practitioner. We call this one the guiding principles of instruction, or often what we call teacher moves. Simply, they are research-based instructional strategies that are really impactful. When we look to our graphic, we actually represent them as braids that cut across all the other factors. That's because we know these instructional strategies help us navigate the differences in those other factors, the different skills that a student brings, the experiences, different motivation, even working in different classes. So there's a lot going on in a systems approach. So maybe let's take a step back from that big picture and really intensely focus in on just one of those factors. So we are going to look at that layers of reading graphic. Again, this is a synthesis of what the research says about those core skills and understandings that all learners need to be effective readers. But even within this one graphic, we've tried to communicate a lot of information. So I'll break it down a little bit. One, you'll see each row highlights one of those critical skills or understandings that we know effective readers have to have. Two, even within each row, you often will see what we call developmental progressions. And that simply is, how do we take that critical skill and apply it in the simplest application all the way to the most complex application? Another thing that you'll see are those gray and pink bands that go around all of those rows of skills. That's our attempt to remind ourselves that even though we are teaching the same skills and understandings to our learners, the way they are taken up is always influenced by those outside factors. But most importantly, when we look to the layers of reading development graphic, we want it to be read through a comprehensive reading lens. What that means is even though we show those skills as separate rows, we know they must work together, which means we must teach them together. And that's because all readers use these skills simultaneously when they are interacting with text. So we often get the question, how did we develop these tools or frameworks? And what we really did was draw on a variety of research perspectives across a diverse body of research. And that's because each perspective brings something different. It lends different considerations or a different lens to reading development. And when we take all of those together, that really helps us address the complexity that's at play when we read. So let's take a quick look at some of these different perspectives that we've drawn on and the key takeaways for us as we plan reading instruction. And we begin with that skill-based model. Now, these ones are the ones that you're probably most familiar with because they've been around for a long time and they're a hot topic in educational media. Skill-based models focus on what are those skills that are necessary to read. Think of Goff and Tumner's Simple View of Reading. Really, they break it down into two key skill groups, language comprehension and decoding. To that, we can add Scarborough's Reading Route, where they took those two key skill groups and they broke it into subcomponents, which is quite helpful for practitioners because it gives us a little bit of a better guide as to exactly what we need to teach and how those skills progress. But we know that looking at skill-based models is not the only thing. So we look to neurological models. When we look at these models, they often tell us that these skills do not develop in isolation. It's not a one at a time process. Rather, researchers like Marianne Wolf talk a lot about that fire together, wire together, which simply means we know we have to work these skills together and simultaneously. Because when we look at the brain models or neural imaging, what we see are these different neural areas are all lighting up at once. The implications for me as a practitioner, well, this means that I need to teach, yes, all of these skills, but really important, I need to give my students opportunity to engage in text that requires them to work all of these skills together, and that's from the youngest of years. A third type of model that we look at are really what we call those sociocultural models. And this is when we start to consider all those other factors at play. If we look at Serafini's work, we think about, what is the purpose for the reading? In other words, what is the reader doing with the text? Or Dukin Cartwright's work, where yes, they are looking at the skills, they are also looking at the role of the student, and they are looking at the role of the text, and they are looking at the social environmental factors, and they put this all together and say, what impact do all of these factors play on how that reader is taking up reading in that moment? The fourth and final type of research perspective that we look to is that we call socially just models. And really, these resonate deeply with Miriam and I as practitioners because they push us to think about reading for a deeper purpose. So when we look to Ackerman and Chambers-Schultz work, they ask us, what do we want our students to do when they leave our classrooms or our institutions? They recognize our students need those core skills and understandings, what they call textual dexterity, that ability to work with the text effectively, but they go further. They look for a broader purpose in our reading instruction, that in fact, we want our students to be engaged, self-efficacious learners who critically engage with text or critically engage with issues and then look to text to engage in those ideas. The implications for us as teachers is really trying to adopt that student lens. So when I look at my reading instruction, what purpose does this particular reading lens serve my student from their eyes, or what resonates with them? These are the important things to consider when we're designing our reading instruction.
Okay, let's shift our approach now to writing. And what we'll talk through in writing is going to mirror what Michelle just spoke through for reading. We're going to start by looking at that big picture, that systems approach of writing. Then we're going to narrow in our focus to the layers of writing framework. And then we're going to share some of the key research perspectives that inform our work and also how we work with teachers to design robust, comprehensive writing instruction. So let's start with that systems approach to writing, and you'll see a lot of similarities with reading. Of course, with writing, we also begin with the learner at the center. When we understand our learners, what they carry with them into our classrooms, their experiences, their languages, their beliefs about themselves, their beliefs about writing, when we understand that, this helps us as practitioners make the best informed decisions to plan for instruction and to plan for our learners in front of us. As we take a step out of that systems approach, that we now have the layers of writing graphic. So just like with reading, this layers of writing development graphic is a synthesis of those core skills and understandings we know writers need to be able to communicate their ideas and their messages. Now, within this one section, we also have woven in the writing process, which is a series of steps that authors take typically when they compose text, any type of text. And for us, these steps, although they're not linear, they are steps that we can teach, that we can model for students to support them in applying and transferring those skills and understandings of the layers of writing. And so for us, these two pieces are really interwoven. They are married together, which is why they live together within this systems approach. We take one step back and we also have those writing communities that we know are at play when we engage with writing instruction. And the last piece we have are those braids, those guiding principles, which for us braid or weave this system together. So these guiding principles, these teacher moves, they're those instructional moves based in research that help us deliver the best writing instruction in the most highly effective ways. Let's take a look at that layers of writing development graphic. So again, this is a framework that lives within that systems approach to writing. Just like with the layers of reading, the layers of writing is a synthesis of the research on writing and what we know we need as skilled writers to communicate our message. So I'll highlight 3 key components of this graphic here. Number 1, the rows highlight individual skills and understandings we need to be able to write. Number 2, within some of those rows, there are developmental progressions where we've taken that skill and we've put it from left to right, from the simplest application of the skill to the most complex. And the third piece, and I think is probably the most important, is understanding that this is a system or this is a comprehensive approach to writing, meaning we recognize that those skills and understandings, they actually are depicted separately as rows, but we don't want to teach them in hierarchy or in isolation. We know that we need to teach them together, that the best writers use all of these together simultaneously when they engage in a writing task. That is something we want to support our students with at every age. Let's take a quick look at some of the research and writing perspectives that we draw on to inform our work. So we'll start with some of those more common skills-based models. Those skills-based models really beautifully highlight those skills, some of those understandings reflected in the layers of writing development framework that we know students need to be able to effectively write and communicate their messages. We often draw from Berninger and Wynn's Not So Simple View of Writing and Sadita's Writing Rope when we take that skills-based lens. In our work, though, we also draw from neurological models, which pull from those skills-based models and then extend our thinking further into how can we weave those skills and those understandings together simultaneously in those complex writing tasks. For us, these models help us frame why it's critical to have students to work on building those skills, those understandings simultaneously, because we know when we look at that brain-based research, they are wiring and firing together. So for maximum effectiveness or impact of instruction, we want to look for those opportunities, even with our youngest writers, to give them opportunities to write text, to draw on and weave together all of those skills and understandings that we see in those skills-based models. The neurological model we often lean into is Harris and colleagues' work around SRSD, self-regulated strategy development. Finally, for writing, we also draw from sociocultural models that, for us, provide us an even broader platform to think about writing and how it can be taught. These sociocultural models encourage us to think beyond just those skills and understandings and into what social, what cultural experiences do students bring into our classrooms, because we know these impact how each student takes up writing. And one of the models we draw from is Graham's Writers Within Community model of writing, where he really beautifully highlights those skills and understandings and then weaves those together with the diverse socio and cultural backgrounds and experiences of both students and teachers, the environments that we build within our classrooms and outside of our classrooms, and how even those external factors to our classrooms all come together to shape our writing instruction. To close this section, we wanted to share one of our favorite quotes from Brené Brown. And she writes, "Builders of greatness are comfortable with paradox. They don't oppress themselves with what we call the tyranny of the or, which pushes people to believe that things must be either A or B, but not both. Instead, they liberate themselves with the genius of the and." And we share this as a reflection to our approach, our beliefs about literacy. For us, we truly believe that the best reading and writing instruction leans into the and, where we draw from multiple perspectives and multiple frameworks and multiple layers of literacy, combining them all to design what we hope is the most effective instruction for diverse learners.
So we know the most effective partnerships have that shared purpose that's rooted in that context, the culture, and the goals for learning. And whether we're working with students, parents, leaders, or teachers, It's that shared purpose that moves the needle, and particularly when it's grounded in the research, because when we use that research to guide that professional learning, really we're helping practitioners know what to focus on, when, and why, and also to examine their practice, because the how we teach really matters. And when we take that what, why, and how approach and embed it in classrooms, schools, and districts, what we end up seeing is this consistency that enhances learning, but it also enhances transfer, both across subjects, but also across lifetimes. So it's that systems approach where when we implement it, we see stronger literacy outcomes. We see empowered teams who feel really confident in designing high quality literacy instruction that ultimately helps them be deeply responsive to their unique learner needs.
We love connecting with teachers and districts around literacy and would love to hear from you. On our website, you can sign up for our newsletter, and you can also find some opportunities to book a 20-minute chat with us to talk about how we might partner with you to meet your needs, your goals, and your context.
So, thank you for joining us. We hope that we provided some insight into the considerations that we think are important when you design your literacy programs.
And remember, please don't hesitate to reach out with questions or wonders via email or book a chat with us on our website. Michelle and I love to talk literacy. Thank you.